Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah, good to be here.
Today, we're tackling a topic that might sound a little bit intimidating at first. It's called the developmental state.
Hmm.
But stick with us, because this isn't just some abstract theory. It's about understanding how some countries manage to achieve crazy economic growth
Right.
and what lessons we can all learn from them,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what your country's political system or history looks like.
Exactly.
We're going to be looking at how government and the economy can work together in some really unexpected ways.
Yeah.
Kind of challenging that idea that free markets are the only way to create prosperity.
It is really interesting how this whole concept of a developmental state kind of turns things upside down
Uh-huh.
from what we usually hear about government intervention.
Right.
It suggests that sometimes a more active role for the government can actually unlock rapid growth.
So to guide us on this deep dive,
Hmm.
we're using an academic chapter by Stephen Haggard.
It's called, and I love this title, it's called Two, The Developmental State is Dead. Long Live the Developmental State.
Catchy.
So what's the main argument here? What's Haggard getting at?
Well, he's building on this guy Chalmers Johnson's work.
Okay.
Johnson's the one who came up with the term developmental state while he was studying Japan's economic miracle after World War II.
Right.
And he argued that Japan's success wasn't just because of, free markets doing their thing,
Uh-huh.
but because of a system he called plan rational,
Plan rational. Okay.
meaning the government actively steered the economy towards specific goals. They picked industries they thought could really take off on a global scale.
So it's not just like protecting industries that already exist. It's
Right.
more about making strategic bets
Yeah.
on what's going to be a winner in the future.
Think about it.
Yeah.
Japan, after the war, was devastated. I mean, completely.
Yeah.
They couldn't just wait around for the market to magically rebuild their economy.
Right. So the government steps in and identifies key sectors like steel electronics, and they just poured resources into them, subsidies,
Wow.
tax breaks. They even helped companies get their hands on foreign technology.
Uh-huh.
This is completely different from that market rational, hands-off approach you see in the U.S.
Yeah, so they had a plan, but did it work?
Ah.
I mean, picking winners and losers like that sounds super risky.
I mean, look at the results.
Yeah.
Japan went from being basically rubble to an economic powerhouse
Uh-huh.
in just a few decades.
Wow.
And it wasn't just Japan, South Korea, Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
They all followed a similar path, focusing on industries like shipbuilding,
Wow.
semiconductors, all that consumer electronic stuff.
So hold on, let me get this straight. Are you saying that by actively supporting these specific industries,
Yeah.
these governments actually help to create these global giants that we all know today, like Samsung,
That's it.
Hyundai, Sony?
Exactly. Take South Korea, for example. They wanted to build a globally competitive textile industry.
Mm.
So they didn't just protect the companies that already existed. They pushed them to modernize, adopt new technologies, even help them find buyers in other countries.
So it's almost like the government was acting as a coach,
Yeah.
not just a referee,
Right.
really pushing these companies to perform at a higher level.
Great analogy. And it's a key point.
Okay.
They weren't just giving handouts, they were demanding results.
Right.
And this leads us to another important concept. This scholar, Alice Amsden, called it disciplining the private sector.
Disciplining.
Yeah.
That sounds intense. What does that mean?
It means holding companies accountable for all that support they were getting.
Right.
Like the South Korean government, they used price controls
Okay.
to keep inflation in check. They didn't want companies just jacking up prices after they got those subsidies.
Right.
They also limited capital flight.
Okay.
They made sure those profits were reinvested back into the country.
So they were really laser focused
Yeah.
on making sure that that government support actually benefited the entire economy,
Exactly.
not just a select few.
That's a really important point. It wasn't just about having a strong state.
Yeah.
It was about having a state that used its power strategically and was accountable.
We've been talking a lot about the policies,
Right.
but what about the governments themselves? What made them capable of actually pulling this off?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this whole model so interesting
Right.
and, frankly, pretty tough to replicate.
Uh-huh.
These governments weren't just strong. They were strong in very specific ways that let them resist all those pressures from special interests
Right.
and make decisions that put long-term growth ahead of short-term political gain.
So it wasn't just about having a plan.
No.
It was about having the right kind of government to actually make it happen.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to dig into next.
Yeah.
What does that right kind of government actually look like?
That's a great place to leave it. For today, we'll be back next time to tackle that very question.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
Okay, so we've established that these developmental states, they weren't just lucky they had these strong strategic governments,
Right.
but where did those governments come from?
Hmm.
I mean, were they just like a product of their own unique circumstances?
Yeah.
Or are there some like broader lessons we can learn
Right.
about how to actually build effective governments?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because a lot of these countries, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan,
Mhm.
they all experienced colonialism,
Right.
which we usually think of as like bad for development.
Of course, yeah.
But some scholars, like Atul Kohli, he argues that in some cases, colonialism actually played a role
Hmm.
in building the foundation for a strong centralized state.
Wait, so colonialism,
Yeah.
which is usually blamed for like holding countries back,
Right.
might have actually helped to create the conditions
It's counterintuitive.
for these successful developmental states.
It is, but it depends on the type of colonialism.
Okay.
Think about South Korea under Japanese rule.
Mm.
It was brutal,
Mm.
it was exploitative,
Right.
but it also involved this push for modernization.
Okay.
The Japanese colonial government, they built infrastructure,
Yeah.
they set up a centralized bureaucracy,
Hmm.
they even encouraged those close ties between the state and certain industries.
So it's almost like colonialism accidentally laid some of the groundwork
Kind of, yeah.
for what would later become the developmental state.
It's a good analogy.
Okay.
But it's important to remember we're not defending colonialism here.
Right.
We're just saying that these historical legacies,
Yeah.
even the negative ones,
Huh?
can shape a country's development in some really unexpected ways.
Right. And of course, colonialism wasn't all the same.
Oh, absolutely not.
Like in Africa,
Yeah.
colonialism led to these weak, fragmented states
Right.
that just couldn't govern effectively. So the kind of state that came out of colonialism
Yes.
really mattered.
Huge.
But it wasn't just colonial history, right?
Not at all.
There had to be other factors.
Absolutely. Like external shocks.
Okay.
Imagine a sudden drop in foreign aid
Right.
or like a major shift in global trade.
Hmm.
These shocks forced countries to adapt.
Yeah.
And the ones with those strong developmental states,
Mhm.
they were better equipped to handle it.
They were able to like pivot
Yeah.
and find those new opportunities
Exactly.
when things changed.
And that ability to adapt,
Yeah.
that comes back to state autonomy.
That's
They
it.
weren't so beholden to these narrow special interests.
Right.
They could make the tough decisions
Yeah.
that might have been unpopular,
Uh-huh.
but were better for the country in the long run.
So it's not just about being strong.
No.
It's about being strong in the right way.
Yeah.
Being able to make those difficult choices.
Exactly.
You got it.
It wasn't just about resisting pressure, right?
Huh.
No, there was also this element of building consensus,
Okay.
forging new coalitions.
Hmm.
These governments, they were good at bringing different groups together,
Okay.
business leaders,
Uh-huh.
labor unions, even academics,
Wow.
to talk about the best way forward.
Like those deliberation councils we talked about?
Exactly. They helped to build trust and a shared vision for the future.
So the state can't just be strong on its own.
Right.
It needs to be connected to society
Yeah,
and be able to work with all these different groups.
absolutely.
So we're getting a pretty complex picture here.
Yeah.
It's not just about strong leaders or good policies.
Oh.
It's about history, context,
Relationship.
relationships, and being able to adapt.
A lot.
But all the examples we've talked about
Right.
have been in countries with pretty authoritarian governments. What happens to this model
Yeah.
when democracy enters the picture?
That's a big one.
Can those two things even coexist?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
We've been talking about this idea of the developmental state, and it seems like a pretty complex thing with a lot of history behind it.
It is.
But as we move into the 21st century,
All right.
the big question is, does this model only work
Mm-hmm.
in places that aren't really democratic?
Yeah.
Can you have a developmental state
Mm.
that's also accountable to its people?
That's a question that a lot of people are debating,
Uh-huh.
especially as countries like South Korea and Taiwan have
Yeah.
become more democratic.
Right.
Some people say that democracy just doesn't work with the developmental state
Mm-hmm.
because democracy is all about different voices and opinions,
Mm.
and that can create short-term pressures
Right.
that clash with the long-term vision that developmental states need.
It's almost like trying to steer a ship where everyone on board wants to have a say in where it's going.
Exactly.
How do you make those tough decisions?
Right.
And stick to a plan when you have to constantly negotiate and compromise?
It's a huge challenge, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But this idea of a democratic developmental state,
Yep.
it's not necessarily impossible.
Mm.
Remember, even during its economic miracle years, Japan had democratic features.
That's true.
And some people argue that democracy can actually make the developmental state even better.
Really, how so?
Well, democracy is supposed to promote transparency and accountability
Right.
that can help reduce corruption, make sure policies actually benefit the public,
Yeah.
and make the state more responsive to what people need.
So democracy could actually help prevent some of the problems that
Exactly.
can come with a really powerful state,
It's about checks and balances.
right?
Can you find that sweet spot where you have a state that's strong enough to get things done, but also accountable to the people?
So are there any examples out there that give us some clues?
About how this might work.
Yeah. Are there any countries that have managed to strike that balance?
There are some that are trying, like Mauritius and Costa Rica.
Okay.
They're often held up as examples of democracies that have developed pretty well with governments that play an active role in their economies.
And what about those classic cases we've been discussing?
Mm.
South Korea and Taiwan. How did they adapt
Yeah.
when they became more democratic?
Well, it wasn't always easy,
Yeah, I can imagine.
but they did show a remarkable ability to adapt.
Yeah.
Like South Korea, after that Asian financial crisis in 97,
Mm-hmm.
they made some big changes to their economic institutions.
Mhm.
They became more transparent and inclusive in their decision-making.
So it's not about just ditching the developmental state model
Right.
once you become democratic.
No, it's more like an evolution.
Okay.
Those core principles, the strategic industrial policy,
Right.
focusing on building state capacity,
Yeah.
that collaboration between government and business,
Yeah.
those can still be useful,
Okay.
but how you put them into practice, that needs to change as the political landscape shifts.
So the developmental state isn't like a one-size-fits-all blueprint?
No, it's more like a set of ideas
Yeah.
that you can adapt and apply to different situations.
And that's a really important point
Yeah.
for anyone who's thinking about economic development.
Whether you're in a developed country dealing with things like climate change
Right.
or a developing country trying to grow quickly.
So what does all this mean for us?
Mm,
What's the big takeaway from our deep dive into the developmental state?
I think it makes us rethink some of our assumptions about the role of government in the economy.
Right.
It suggests that a more active and strategic government
Okay.
can be a really powerful force for progress.
Hmm.
It shows how important it is to build strong institutions
Yeah.
and have a collaborative approach to development.
And it reminds us that there's no single solution.
Exactly. Context is key.
But maybe most importantly, it encourages us to be creative,
Yeah.
to think outside the box,
That's-
and to explore new ways of achieving sustainable and inclusive growth.
And with all the challenges we're facing, like
Yeah.
climate change and inequality,
Yeah.
these lessons from the developmental state feel more relevant than ever.
It's a call to be ambitious, to think big, and to really consider what government can do
Yeah.
to create a better future.
It's not just about looking back at history, it's about learning from it
Right.
and using those lessons to tackle the challenges we face today.
That's a great point to end on.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It is fun.
We hope you found this exploration of the developmental state thought-provoking
Yeah.
and maybe even spark some new ideas.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries.
Great advice. Until next time.
See you later.